Australia needs to rethink its national security strategy. The Lowy Institute report says decision makers require a greater diversity of assessments to make sure they're making the right calls in complex situations. Joining me now is analysis paper author Ben Scott, a former senior intelligence officer and also research fellow with the Lowy Institute. Thanks for your time. So just break this down for me. What are we talking about in terms of a change on the current decision-making process and what you're saying should happen?
So, Tom, what the paper argues is that what's changed, what makes Australia's current national security environment so different from anything we've faced before is not that we're necessarily yet any more insecure than we've been in the past. We're not at war, we're not under armed attack, we're not even as engaged in military conflict as we have been in the past, but the range of threats that we face is much wider than it's ever been before. I mean, it goes all the way from one extreme, climate change, a threat to the planet, through to counter-terrorism, which is still a continuing issue, in fact an even more complicated issue with ever more variations of terrorism appearing, cyber emerging as a whole new domain to challenge, and on top of that we have continuing uncertainties about both China and the US and the way that competition is going to play out. So what the paper argues is that this complexity is really what's new, and this complexity is going to throw up for our national security decision makers all kinds of tough choices that we haven't faced before, much tougher, but also decisions we'll have to make under much more pressure because the whole environment is much more competitive. So we can respond to that in a few different ways, and one of them is to draft a new national security strategy that a lot of people have argued for, something which would help guide our decision makers, guide our policy makers and implementers, and hopefully integrate the whole national security bureaucracy more and make it more flexible. But what I say is that that's all very well, but it's still limited. It's only going to help us so much, precisely because our environment is changing so quickly and it's becoming so much more complex. I mean, if we were to have put together such a strategy immediately before COVID, it would have been out of date as soon as COVID broke. If we'd done such a strategy before Russia invaded Ukraine, it also would have looked kind of out of date. And that's the sort of experience the Americans had. That they had their national security strategy ready to go before Russia invaded Ukraine and then had to redraft the whole thing. So what I'm saying is that a national security strategy is a good idea, but really the pressure point and the thing we have to work on most is the way that we make national security decisions. To do that in a much more rigorous and methodical way.
Yeah. So what is not rigorous about it though? Because obviously I don't think many people would argue with the complexities we're now facing and difficult decisions and no easy ones when you just think about the threat of China. But as it stands, yes, we've got people making the decisions, whether it be National Security Committee, Cabinet, or in Defence, you've got Richard Marles making decisions, and what we assume are these pretty big departments with complex briefings. So are they not getting all the complexity there, and still you ultimately need to be making decisions at a minister level? What's specifically wrong with how all that works?
Right, so it's a lot of it's fine-tuning, but it's also following through on the way that we've approached this problem really since the war. So if you look at the history of the way we've tried to deal with national security problems since the war, there's been an effort to impose more structure on those types of decisions, to deal with them differently to the way we deal with other decisions. So that includes things like having the Advisory War Council in the Second World War. In the 70s and 80s, we did a lot of reform, the way we deal with intelligence. We set up what became the NSC. The NSC itself was only established in 1906. And all along you have this effort to impose more structure, but what inevitably happens is that politics comes to play, personalities come to play, Cabinet makes decisions the way that Cabinet makes decisions, which ends up being a bit of a muddle quite often. I mean, it's very easy, or it's much easier in theory to design processes and to commit to the idea of being rigorous and methodical in theory, but to do it in practice requires real discipline. We don't quite have that yet. There's a second part to it, if I can just continue. So that's all following through. But the new thing that I think we need to do is the way we provide assessments to the National Security Committee of Cabinet. I mean, the natural impulse of decision makers and the bureaucracy is for the bureaucracy to come up with one set of recommendations supported by a cohesive assessment that's ironed out all the differences and just got one thing in front of the NSC at the time the decision is made. What I'm saying is that our environment is now so much more complex that we can't do that, that the price of that cohesion is often ironing out differences that should be in front of the NSC. So the NSC should be hearing about the security dimension, the economic dimension, the environmental dimension, the technological dimension, and even when those assessments conflict and and point in a different direction, NSC should still hear all of that. So the decision makers at the time they make the decision have all that complexity in mind and are not doing what we're all hardwired to do, which is to simplify as quickly as possible to find the easiest route to making a decision.
I'm just jumping in because we're nearly out of time. So how does that apply practically? I mean, let's take the subs, because we had all sorts of different decisions over various years and we still don't have a final one. Is that an example of where this might have helped?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know all the detail on how the AUKUS subs decision was made, but we do know that the decision was made quite quickly by a small number of people, and there's still a lot of questions about it that haven't been answered. We don't know exactly when they'll come, if they'll ever come, exactly how much, what it's going to cost, how we're going to crew them. So we can't say for sure that a more rigorous approach that I'm advocating would have produced a better decision, but it's almost certain that it wouldn't have produced a worse decision. So exactly that's the kind of decision that I think, and we're going to face those sorts of decisions, and we need to make them much more carefully and methodically.
We'll have to leave it there. Ben, Scott, thank you.
Thank you for your time.